Our second speaker is Esther Osalenlen Adu, and she's a PhD researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies and Institute for International Law at KU Leuven. And she's also a research associate at the America-Europe Fund's Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation. Her research mostly focuses on the legal implications of unilateral supply chain regulations from a WTO law perspective. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, all. Firstly, I'd like to thank the conveners of YELS for bringing together such a stellar group of scholars across the international economic law discipline. I truly look forward to subsequent discussions with learned colleagues here today. So, as already mentioned in my bio, my research focuses a lot on the intersection of innovation, regulation, and technology and international regulation. So it comes at no surprise that my paper focuses on supply chain regulation, being at the center of the chip war, which I consider to be the new tool of choice in an era of techno-economic competition. And the background to this paper is actually twofold. Firstly, it was mainly derived from my concurrent research, which I'm currently undertaking under my doctoral project, which centrally tries to figure out the legal implications of unilateral trade-related measures that target critical global value chains, especially from a trade law perspective. Crucially, my project proposes the integration of concepts and frameworks from value chain scholarship into the legal analysis of a category of trade-related measures which I class as supply chain instruments. So in my paper, I already provided a preliminary framework where I kind of view these instruments as a category of semi and fully autonomous instruments that condition market access, so you have that prescriptive element, in the enforcement of non-economic objectives along key nodes of critical global value chains. As I contend that the proliferation and essentially the creation of these global value chains are intrinsically connected to the origin story of our present global trade law system. For example, at the turn of the century, while these GVCs were in their earnest beginnings, that also coincided with the founding of the WTO, and of course the consolidation of key provisions within the GATT, for example, the permissibility of members creating these preferential trade agreements with the goal of further regionalizing the gains of multilateral trade liberalization. As such, considering the present exogenous factors from persistent trade and tariff wars, the waning influence of the WTO, and the proliferation of broad-based industrial policies across both advanced and emerging economies, which are essentially fracturing the global trade systems, nation-states are increasingly designing their interventions to mirror the structural dynamics of value-added trade. So I briefly provided some key definitions regarding these concepts, because especially from the eyes of trade law scholars, these are quite new and technical concepts. So for example, global value chains essentially consist of the full range of activities firms, farmers, and workers kind of carry out to bring a product to the market from its conception to end use. So it really covers the whole range of activities and stages of the production process from end to end. So we've essentially turned into a global economic trade system where we used to be operating under the trade of finished goods. Now our global trade system consists of the trade of intermediate goods, known as value-added trade. So to exemplify the saliency of this integrated law GVC approach in the legal analysis of these trade-related measures, I designed a case study which sits at the heart of the present techno-economic competition, which is the global semiconductor supply chain, literally the backbone of the concurrent twin transitions, whether in tech, for example, AI, AGI, and of course, green energy. To kind of exemplify the saliency of this integrated approach. So in applying GVC methodologies, I mapped out the global semiconductor value chain and focus in particular on the EU and US's policy interventions as contained in their respective CHIPS Act. Because at the time of the writing, at the time when I was writing and drafting this paper, both markets represented about 62% of the global semiconductor value chain. So as you can clearly see from the distribution of the key nodes of the global semiconductor value chain, the EU and US have capabilities, for example, in the upstream of the value chain, whether in R&D, design, even manufacturing equipment. But when it comes to materials, fabrication, assembly, testing, and packaging, that is mainly the domain now in East Asian markets. So, as part of this exercise in elucidating the saliency of this integrated law GVC approach, my research resultant legal analysis was guided by three main questions. Firstly, whether the selected instruments are supply chain instruments, because within the academic literature, they still treat them as part and parcel of industrial policy. So this is basically where I begin to test my framework of whether these respective CHIPS Acts could be classed as a category of semi or fully autonomous instruments that condition market access in the enforcement of non-economic objectives. In other words, are these supply chain instruments? The second question then looks at whether the selected instrument exhibit this whole of supply chain approach, which covers these critical GVCs end-to-end, rather than only address the respective states' vulnerabilities. Recall, for example, the slide that I showed, the previous slide on the mapping out to the global semiconductor value chain. It is very clear that the EU and US have certain capabilities in the upstream stage of the value chain, but not in the downstream. So one would expect that their respective CHIPS Acts would only address their vulnerabilities in the downstream sector of the supply chain. Then my last question looks into whether their particular approach to the semiconductor value chain can be linked to their geo-economic objectives, which has already been mentioned in the room previously, whether on the EU side it was on the risking and the US on decoupling. So firstly, to answer the first and second question, I've already provided some core findings from my initial legal analysis, which takes a really GVC lens in the textual analysis of these respective CHIPS Acts. So, as already hinted, both instruments show this whole of supply chain approach in their respective instruments, covering literally key nodes of the semiconductor value chain end to end, not just their capabilities or vulnerabilities. This is despite the fact that they have disparate funding structures and capabilities. For example, the US uses a more market-based approach, for example, the issuance of tax credits, really leveraging upon its deep capital market to reshore key domestic capabilities, but also reinvest in its vulnerabilities. The EU uses, for example, existing funding structures, like, for example, the Horizon project, but approaches also the issue of funding through a public-private lens. This is seen in key legal provisions in the EU CHIPS Acts pertaining to investment facilitation, for example, simplifying the administrative process of permitting and so on. But both CHIPS Acts do show how they aim to protect their existing capabilities through an economic security lens. For example, the EU CHIPS Act incorporates Article 4 of the FDI screening mechanism. The US's CHIPS Act has this 10-year outbound investment ban, meaning that if you are a recipient of these public grants, you are basically you are banned from actually engaging in transactions with particular jurisdictions the US has classed as entities of concern. So that already answers the first research questions 1 and 2, but how about the last question? We've already established that there's this whole of supply chain approach in these respective instruments, but can they be linked to these geo-economic objectives of the risking and decoupling? Well, recently in Global Value Chain Scholarship, they have kind of reoriented the Global Value Chain framework in light of the present securitized environment, by focusing in particular their attention to state interventions and their implications, especially from a firm level perspective. This is seen in the inside out and outside in approach, which shows both state interventions from advanced and emerging economies. As my case study is only focused on the EU-US, which are advanced economies, my framework of this GVC integrated approach is quite is quite different, but still aligns with the main methodological framework and approach. So if we look at it inside out, what kind of measures do they institute domestically which could be linked to these geo-economic objectives? For example, in line of the EU's own de-risking strategy, it utilizes these public financing models, plus the inbound investment screening in order to reshore key upstream capabilities, but also reinvest in its strategic vulnerabilities when it comes to fabrication. On the US, in continuance of its goal of decoupling critical sectors from countries it deems as entities of concern, utilizes these market-based financing structures together with federal support structures in order to consolidate US capabilities in upstream part of the sector, while also localizing its downstream stages of the global semiconductor value chain. This is seen, for example, the immense financial instruments that have been issued that encourage, for example, the utilization of US steel or North American steel in the key infrastructures surrounding the semiconductor value chain fabrication process. Now, let's look at whether there could be linkages made between this domestic geoeconomic strategy with how these states engage externally. Well, if we look first at the EU, we see a continuance of this de-risking strategy guiding its international cooperation efforts. This is in part also influenced by the mentions of strategic autonomy, which already has been mentioned by my Leuven colleague here, which has been mentioned throughout key policy documentation surrounding the adoption and after the adoption of the EU Chips Act to be a key core geoeconomic objective. Mainly, for example, to rebalance dependencies in the global value chain. So you see that language of union strategic autonomy very visible in how they design, for example, these trade and technology councils with the US and India, and of course, its recent MOU with Japan. In the US, on the other hand, in continuance of the strategy of decoupling, there's been a clear legislative reordering of its main foreign trade instruments. For example, this classification of entities of concern, because subsequent executive orders the adoption of the US Chips Act and after really have classified China, North Korea, and others as systemic rivals. So in continuance of that strategy, you see, for example, the establishment of this outbound investment rule, especially within the CHIPS Act, but also in connection to consolidating the strategy in expanded export control regime to really maintain the US's technological edge when it comes to advanced semiconductor value chains. Semiconductors, especially in its application, especially as we are amid the twin tech transitions, whether in AI and, of course, green energy production. So just to conclude, in essence, the case study and this integrated law GVC approach really has demonstrated the heuristic value it could provide for trade law scholars. In that, it really expands our analytical toolkit in order to situate the contextual factors that are shaping state intervention in critical GVCs, providing a real solid basis for us to explore the legal implications from a trade law perspective, something which I think is missing in the current discourse, because even recent WTO panel disputes do hint at the fact that something is missing in our analytical toolkit to really understand how and why states are increasingly utilizing their position along these key critical value chains and how they design these unilateral trade-related measures. Something which has already been discussed recently, for example, in the US IRA panel report, which came out in January 2026, but also previously as well. There was a dispute called US-China certain tariff measures, which also delved into this issue of overcapacity and the fact that increasingly the US is using these unilateral trade measures to protect its own domestic capabilities, especially through a supply chain mindset. So we really see this tension between the traditional market access obligations as enshrined within WTO legal architecture, and of course how the fact that there's a lack of consensus on how to address the inherent vulnerabilities that come with value-added trade, especially in the present geo-economic climate. So it is my hope that this research sparks new discussions within trade law scholarship on how we could enrich our analytical toolkit that truly confronts the reality of the present GVC world and helps us, maybe, possibly, to rethink our approach when it comes to WTO compliance, but possibly also WTO reform in this new GVC reality. I'll stop there, and I welcome your questions in the later discussions. Thank you.